Something is happening in the world that many people sense but struggle to explain. A quiet unease, a feeling that something fundamental is shifting beneath the surface of everyday life. Jesus spoke about a time when people would continue eating, working, marrying, planning their future, completely absorbed in normal life, while something enormous was unfolding around them. Not chaos first, normalcy. That was the warning. The last days would not begin with everyone suddenly aware of what was happening. They would begin with people distracted, focused on survival, comfort, entertainment, ambition. Meanwhile, the deeper currents of history would already be moving. If you look closely at the words Jesus spoke about the end of the age, the warnings are not mysterious codes. They are patterns of human behavior that repeat whenever society drifts far enough from truth. And some of those patterns are already visible in ways that would have been difficult to imagine a generation ago. The first warning Jesus described was deception on a massive scale. Not just lies, but persuasive lies. Convincing voices, charismatic leaders, ideas that feel compassionate and progressive, while quietly pulling people away from truth. He said many would come in his name, claiming authority, and many would be deceived. Notice what he emphasized. Not that a few would be fooled, many. Deception works because it mixes truth with distortion. It speaks in language people want to hear. It promises freedom while slowly redefining what freedom means. And the danger is not only false teachers outside the church. The deeper danger is when believers themselves begin adjusting truth to match cultural pressure, when the words of Christ are softened to avoid offense, when conviction becomes negotiable. Deception does not arrive announcing itself as rebellion. It arrives sounding reasonable, compassionate, modern. If you have ever noticed how quickly moral boundaries shift, when enough people agree to reinterpret them, you have seen the first warning at work. And if you believe truth should never be questioned simply because it is ancient, you are already standing in the tension Jesus described. Because deception in the last days will not look like obvious darkness. It will look like light that has been slightly redirected. That is why discernment matters. If you value clarity about the times we are living in, take a moment right now and let the quiet commitment form inside you to keep listening carefully to the words of Christ rather than the noise of the moment. Because the next warning he gave is even more unsettling. He spoke about a world where conflict would multiply, nations rising against nations, kingdoms against kingdoms. At first glance, that sounds like every period of history. Humanity has always experienced war. But Jesus described something different. Not isolated conflict, but an atmosphere of escalating instability, alliances shifting, tensions spreading across regions, the kind of unrest that makes people feel like the ground beneath civilization is less stable than it once seemed. What makes this warning unique is that he did not say war itself would signal the end. He said these would be the beginning of birth pains. Anyone who understands that metaphor knows what it means. Birth pains increase in intensity and frequency as the moment approaches. They begin slowly, spaced apart, almost manageable. But over time, they become closer together, stronger, harder to ignore. That image suggests that the last days would not unfold as a single catastrophic moment, but as a process, a sequence of pressures building over time. And if you pay attention to global conversations today, you will hear a common theme, a sense that stability is fragile, that long-standing systems are under strain, that the future is less predictable than it once appeared. Jesus warned that when people see these things begin to unfold, fear will spread. But he also said something that believers often overlook. See that you are not troubled, not because the events themselves are pleasant, but because panic blinds people. Fear makes people reactive instead of discerning. When anxiety dominates a culture, deception spreads faster because frightened people cling to any voice that promises security. Which leads to another warning that Jesus gave, one that touches the spiritual condition of humanity itself. He said that in the last days the love of many would grow cold, not the love of a few. Many. The phrase he used suggests something gradual, like warmth slowly leaving a room. No dramatic explosion, just a steady cooling. Relationships becoming more transactional. Compassion becoming selective. People protecting themselves emotionally rather than opening their lives to others. If you examine modern culture carefully, you will see an interesting paradox. Technology connects people across continents, yet loneliness continues to grow. Communication accelerates, yet misunderstanding deepens. People are surrounded by voices, yet many feel unseen. That quiet cooling of love is not always expressed through cruelty. Often it appears as indifference, as emotional distance, as the quiet decision to stop caring deeply because caring feels exhausting. Jesus warned that this cooling would be connected to increasing lawlessness. When moral boundaries dissolve, trust dissolves with them. When trust dissolves, relationships weaken. When relationships weaken, love becomes fragile. The danger is not simply social breakdown. The danger is spiritual fatigue. People begin protecting themselves from disappointment by lowering their expectations of goodness altogether. But Jesus gave a counterpoint to that warning. He said, "The one who endures to the end will be saved." Endurance is not dramatic heroism. It is the quiet choice to remain faithful when faithfulness feels inconvenient. When compassion feels risky, when love feels costly, and that endurance becomes even more important when another warning he described begins to surface more clearly. He spoke about a time when truth itself would become increasingly uncomfortable to hear. People would resist it, not because they cannot understand it, but because it interferes with the lives they prefer to live. When truth confronts desire, desire often tries to silence truth. That process rarely begins with open hostility. It begins with subtle dismissal. Truth is labeled outdated, judgmental, irrelevant. Over time, those labels grow stronger until truth itself becomes unwelcome in public conversation. Jesus warned that those who follow him would experience pressure because of this shift. Not necessarily violent persecution everywhere, but social pressure, ridicule, exclusion, the feeling of standing against the current rather than drifting with it. For many believers, this warning is uncomfortable because it contradicts the idea that faith should always feel culturally accepted. But Jesus never promised universal approval. He promised presence. If you have ever felt the quiet pressure to soften your convictions in order to avoid conflict, you have already brushed against this warning. The challenge of the last days will not only be external chaos, it will be internal courage. The courage to remain aligned with truth even when agreement becomes rare. And yet even these warnings do not represent the full picture of what Jesus described. Because alongside deception, conflict, cooling love, and resistance to truth, he also spoke about something unexpected happening at the same time. The message of the kingdom spreading across the world in ways previous generations could never have imagined. A global witness, a movement of faith reaching cultures, languages, and communities that had never heard it before. The same age that produces confusion will also produce opportunity. The same technology that spreads misinformation can also carry truth further than ever. The last days are not only a story of decline, they are also a story of decision, of people choosing what they will trust when every voice demands their attention. And the deeper question beneath every warning Jesus gave is not simply when these things will happen, but how people will respond when they do. The next warning Jesus gave is one that many people overlook because it does not describe a sudden disaster, but a slow erosion of discernment. He spoke about a time when false prophets would rise and mislead many people. Notice again the word many, not a fringe group, not a handful of unstable voices. Many. False prophets do not succeed because they appear obviously dangerous. They succeed because they sound familiar. They use spiritual language. They quote fragments of truth. They speak with confidence and promise clarity in confusing times. In periods of uncertainty, people crave voices that sound certain. The more unstable the world feels, the more attractive, confident leadership becomes. And this is where the danger grows, because confidence does not equal truth. Jesus warned that spiritual deception in the last days would not simply come from outside belief systems attacking Christianity. It would also come from within religious environments themselves. Voices claiming authority, voices claiming revelation, voices offering interpretations that feel comforting because they remove tension from difficult teachings. If you study history carefully, you will notice that every generation produces leaders who attract followers by simplifying complicated truths. They promise spiritual shortcuts. They promise certainty without surrender. They promise peace without repentance. And people listen because the message feels easier to carry. But Jesus never built his teachings around convenience. He built them around transformation. That is why discernment becomes essential in times like these. Discernment is not suspicion of everyone. It is clarity about the character of truth. It is the ability to measure every voice against the teachings of Christ rather than against the popularity of the speaker. The danger of false prophets is not simply that they speak lies. It is that they reshape truth so gradually that people adjust without noticing. A teaching that once sounded strange slowly becomes normal. A boundary that once felt clear slowly becomes flexible. Over time, the difference between conviction and opinion begins to blur, and when that happens, faith becomes easier to manipulate. If you are living in a time when spiritual voices are multiplying, when opinions spread faster than wisdom, and when people compete for influence in the name of faith, then the warning Jesus gave becomes deeply relevant, because the question is no longer simply what someone says about God. The question is whether what they say aligns with the words God has already spoken. That alignment matters more than charisma. It matters more than confidence. It matters more than how many people are listening. And if you are someone who wants to remain steady in a time when voices compete for your trust, one quiet decision will matter more than almost anything else. Make the words of Christ your reference point, not the mood of the moment, not the loudest teacher, not the most persuasive personality, the words of Christ. Because when truth is anchored there, deception loses much of its power. But Jesus did not stop with warnings about deception alone. He also spoke about something that would test the endurance of believers themselves. He said that many would fall away. That phrase is heavier than it sounds. It does not describe people who never believed. It describes people who once walked in faith and later abandoned it. The reason this warning matters is because it confronts a quiet assumption many people carry. The assumption that faith, once started, automatically continues. But faith is not maintained by momentum alone. It is sustained by commitment. When pressure increases, when suffering appears, when unanswered questions linger, belief can begin to feel fragile. And in those moments, people face a decision. Do they lean deeper into trust, or do they slowly step back from it? Jesus said that in the last days many would step back. Not always dramatically, often quietly. Faith becomes less central. Prayer becomes less frequent. Obedience becomes negotiable. Over time, the relationship that once felt alive becomes distant. What makes this warning particularly sobering is that Jesus connects it with betrayal and hostility, among people who once shared belief. Relationships fracture, communities divide, trust weakens. When faith is tested under pressure, the hidden motives inside people begin to surface. Some discover a deeper resilience. Others discover that their foundation was not as strong as they believed. This is not a warning designed to create fear. It is a warning designed to create awareness. Because the strength of faith is not measured when everything feels easy. It is measured when following Christ becomes costly. And if you live in a culture where commitment is often temporary, where identity shifts quickly, and where truth is frequently negotiated rather than defended, then the warning about falling away becomes deeply relevant. It reminds believers that faith must be rooted in something deeper than emotion. Emotion changes with circumstance. Conviction holds when circumstances change, and conviction grows through relationship with God rather than through occasional inspiration, which leads to another warning Jesus gave that is both sobering and hopeful at the same time. He said that as darkness increases in the world, the message of the kingdom will still move forward. In fact, it will reach the entire world as a testimony to all nations. That statement would have sounded impossible to the people listening to him at the time. They lived in a world where travel was slow, communication was limited, and cultural barriers were enormous. Yet today, the message of faith crosses continents instantly. Languages are translated, conversations happen across borders. Communities that once had no access to the teachings of Christ are now hearing them. This does not cancel the warnings about deception or conflict. Instead, it reveals something important about the last days. They are not defined only by decline. They are defined by contrast. Darkness intensifies in some places, while light spreads in others. Confusion increases while truth becomes more accessible. Pressure grows while faith deepens among those who hold on to it. And that contrast forces every person to decide what voice they will trust. Because in a world where information travels instantly, the real challenge is not access to knowledge. The real challenge is discernment about which knowledge leads to life. Jesus did not describe the last days, so people could speculate endlessly about timelines. He described them so people could remain awake, awake to deception, awake to pressure, awake to the quiet cooling of love, but also awake to opportunity, because every warning he gave carried an underlying invitation. Remain faithful, remain aware, remain grounded in truth even when the world around you feels increasingly unstable. And the deeper you listen to those warnings, the clearer it becomes that the final signs he spoke about are not only external events, they also reveal the condition of the human heart. One of the most sobering warnings Jesus gave about the last days was not about governments, disasters, or global systems. It was about the human heart. He said people would be living their lives just as they always had, eating and drinking, marrying and planning, completely absorbed in ordinary routines until the moment arrived that changed everything. He compared it to the days of Noah. Life looked normal. Fields were planted, families were built, conversations happened in markets and homes. And yet beneath that ordinary surface, something irreversible was approaching. The people of Noah's time were not unaware because they lacked intelligence. They were unaware because they were distracted. The warning here is subtle but powerful. The last days would not necessarily feel dramatic at first. They would feel ordinary. Life would continue. People would pursue careers, build homes, celebrate milestones. Meanwhile, the deeper spiritual condition of the world would be shifting quietly. That kind of distraction is dangerous because it numbs awareness. When daily life becomes the center of attention, eternity slowly moves to the edge of our thinking. Jesus was not condemning normal life. He was revealing how easily normal life can become spiritual sleep. it is possible to stay busy while losing clarity about what truly matters. And if there is one pattern visible in modern culture, it is the constant pull toward distraction. Endless information, endless entertainment, endless noise competing for attention. None of these things are evil by themselves, but together they create an environment where reflection becomes rare. People move quickly from one moment to the next without asking deeper questions, without pausing long enough to examine where life is heading. That is the kind of atmosphere Jesus warned about. Not universal wickedness first, but widespread distraction. A generation so immersed in the present that it forgets the larger story unfolding around it. If you look honestly at the pace of modern life, you can see how easily that condition develops. People wake up to notifications, move through crowded schedules, collapse into exhaustion at night, and repeat the cycle again. Days pass quickly, weeks disappear, years begin to blur together, and somewhere in that rhythm, the deeper purpose of life can fade from view. Jesus warned that this kind of spiritual sleep would make the final moment unexpected for many people. Not because the signs were invisible, but because attention was elsewhere. The challenge of the last days is not simply surviving global events. It is remaining spiritually awake in a culture that rewards distraction. Staying aware requires intention. It requires the willingness to step back from constant noise and ask honest questions about direction and purpose. And when people begin asking those questions, another warning Jesus gave begins to come into focus. He said that people's hearts would fail them from fear as they watch what is happening in the world. Fear has always existed, but the kind of fear Jesus described spreads rapidly when uncertainty increases, when people feel like the systems they rely on are fragile, when the future appears unstable. Fear has a powerful effect on human behavior. It pushes people toward extremes. Some react by withdrawing, trying to protect themselves from every possible threat. Others react by grasping for control, supporting voices that promise security at any cost. And in that atmosphere, truth becomes easier to distort, because frightened people often choose reassurance over reality. Jesus did not describe fear in the last days to amplify panic. He described it so believers would recognize the difference between fear and discernment. Discernment observes events with clarity. Fear magnifies them until clarity disappears. When anxiety dominates the human heart, people begin making decisions based on survival alone. And survival without wisdom rarely produces peace. That is why Jesus repeatedly told his followers not to let their hearts be troubled, not because the world would become calm, but because their foundation should be deeper than the circumstances around them. If your sense of security depends entirely on the stability of society, every global shift will shake you. But if your security rests in something eternal, then even uncertain times cannot steal your perspective. The warning about fear in the last days reveals a deeper question. What anchors the human heart when everything else feels unstable? For many people, the answer has been comfort, wealth, progress, or control. But history shows that those anchors shift quickly when pressure increases. Jesus pointed people toward a different foundation, one rooted in relationship with God rather than in the structures of society. And that foundation becomes even more important when another warning he gave begins to unfold. He spoke about a time when spiritual deception would become so persuasive that even sincere believers could be misled if they were not careful. That warning does not mean truth disappears. It means confusion multiplies, competing voices rise, competing interpretations spread, and people must decide what standard they will use to evaluate what they hear. In an age where information travels instantly, that challenge becomes even more intense. People are exposed to thousands of opinions every day. Some of those opinions claim spiritual authority. Some claim secret insight, others promise certainty about the future. The danger is not simply misinformation, the danger is overload. When people hear too many voices, they begin trusting the ones that feel most comforting or most confident. But confidence is not evidence of truth. Jesus warned that discernment in the last days would require something deeper than emotional reaction. It would require returning again and again to the words he already spoke. Those words become the compass that keeps people oriented when every other voice tries to pull them in a different direction. And when that compass remains steady, another warning Jesus described begins to make more sense. Because the last days are not only about deception, fear, or distraction. They are also about the revealing of what truly lives inside the human heart. Another warning Jesus gave about the last days touches something deeply uncomfortable, because it reveals that the greatest spiritual danger is not always open rebellion against God. Sometimes the greater danger is quiet indifference. Jesus described a condition where people would become spiritually dull, not necessarily hostile toward faith, not aggressively opposed to truth, but slowly less responsive to it. The heart becomes heavy. Awareness fades, conviction softens. Over time, the things that once stirred a person's conscience no longer feel urgent. This kind of spiritual dullness rarely appears overnight. It grows gradually, almost unnoticed. A person hears truth often enough that it begins to feel familiar rather than transformative. Words that once challenged the heart start sounding routine. Prayer becomes occasional rather than essential. Reflection becomes rare. Faith shifts from relationship to background identity. That is the condition Jesus warned about when he said people must remain watchful. Watchfulness is not paranoia, it is awareness. It is the refusal to drift into spiritual sleep simply because life feels stable. In every generation, there have been believers who assume that faith will remain strong without attention, but the human heart does not work that way. Whatever we stop feeding slowly weakens. Whatever we stop guarding slowly erodes. If you have ever noticed how quickly habits change when attention shifts elsewhere, you understand the principle Jesus was describing. In the last days, that erosion becomes more widespread because the surrounding culture increasingly encourages distraction rather than reflection. When everything moves quickly, people stop examining themselves carefully. They react instead of considering. They absorb ideas without measuring them, and over time, the ability to recognize spiritual danger weakens. Jesus warned his followers to remain awake precisely because this drift is so subtle. No one plans to become spiritually dull. It happens through neglect, through the slow replacement of intentional faith with comfortable routine. And when that routine becomes the center of spiritual life, another warning Jesus gave begins to unfold more clearly. He spoke about a time when loyalty to him would be tested in ways people did not expect. Many imagine persecution only in dramatic terms, as open hostility or violence. But the testing Jesus described often begins in quieter ways: social pressure, cultural expectation, the subtle suggestion that certain beliefs should remain private or flexible. In many places, the pressure is not to abandon faith completely, but to reshape it, to remove the parts that feel inconvenient or unpopular, to present a version of belief that fits comfortably within prevailing cultural values. That pressure can feel reasonable at first. After all, everyone wants to avoid unnecessary conflict. But Jesus warned that following him would sometimes require standing apart from the crowd rather than blending into it. The challenge of the last days is not simply whether people believe in God. It is whether they remain loyal to truth when loyalty carries a cost. That cost might be misunderstanding. It might be criticism. It might be exclusion from certain spaces where conformity is expected. And yet, loyalty has always been the dividing line between admiration and discipleship. Admiration applauds from a distance. Loyalty stays even when the environment becomes uncomfortable. If you live in a time where cultural winds shift quickly and convictions are constantly renegotiated, the warning Jesus gave about loyalty becomes deeply relevant, because the strength of faith is revealed when agreement disappears. It is easy to speak about belief when belief feels socially acceptable. It is harder when belief invites tension, but tension is often where faith becomes real. And Jesus did not speak about these pressures as if they would destroy every believer. Instead, he spoke about them as refining moments that reveal the difference between shallow commitment and deep conviction. That refining process leads directly into another warning he gave, one that carries both urgency and hope at the same time. He said that when people begin seeing these patterns unfold, they should not panic or collapse in despair. Instead, they should look up, not because the world will suddenly become easy again, but because the ultimate story is still moving toward completion. That perspective matters because the last days are often discussed only in terms of fear. Yet the warnings Jesus gave were not meant to paralyze people with anxiety. They were meant to prepare them for clarity. Preparation changes the way people interpret events. When someone expects difficulty, they are not shocked when it arrives. When someone understands the larger story unfolding through history, they do not mistake every crisis for the end itself. Jesus repeatedly emphasized that the timing of the final moment would remain unknown to human beings. That uncertainty prevents unhealthy obsession with speculation. Instead, it redirects attention toward readiness. Readiness is not about predicting dates, it is about living in alignment with truth, regardless of when the final moment arrives. And that kind of readiness shapes the daily life of believers more than any specific timeline ever could. Because if the warnings Jesus gave about deception, distraction, fear, spiritual dullness, and tested loyalty are already visible in the world, then the most important question is not how close the end might be. The most important question is how people choose to live while these signs unfold around them. One of the most striking warnings Jesus gave about the last days is that many people would see the signs unfolding around them and still misinterpret what they meant, not because the signs were hidden, but because their expectations about the future were different from what God had actually revealed. Throughout history, people have often assumed that the end of an age would arrive suddenly, dramatically, with unmistakable clarity for everyone at the same moment. But Jesus described something far more complex, a period where multiple conditions develop at the same time, deception increasing, conflict intensifying, love cooling, truth resisted, faith tested, yet ordinary life continuing. That combination creates confusion. Some people dismiss the signs completely, assuming nothing meaningful is happening. Others become consumed by speculation, trying to predict every detail of the future. Jesus warned against both reactions. The first leads to complacency. The second leads to obsession. Neither produces clarity. Instead, he pointed his followers toward something much simpler but far more demanding: readiness. Readiness is not about decoding every event in global news. It is about the condition of the heart. Are you living in alignment with truth today? Are you awake to what God is doing in your life right now? Are your priorities shaped by eternal perspective rather than by the pressure of the moment? Those questions matter more than any timeline. Because the deeper message behind every warning Jesus gave is that the last days will reveal what people truly trust. When systems shake, when expectations collapse, when uncertainty spreads, whatever foundation a person has built their life upon becomes visible. If that foundation is temporary comfort, fear will dominate. If that foundation is public approval, compromise will follow. But if that foundation is trust in God, then even turbulent times cannot remove the deeper sense of direction. The warning about readiness becomes especially important when another sign Jesus described begins to appear more clearly. He spoke about a world where spiritual confusion grows alongside spiritual opportunity. In other words, the same period that produces deception also produces awakening. This contrast is one of the most fascinating elements of the last days. Darkness does not simply replace light. Instead, the two grow side by side, forcing people to decide which direction they will move. Some respond to uncertainty by seeking deeper truth. They begin asking questions they ignored before. They re-examine their assumptions. They look for something stable in a world that feels increasingly unstable. Others respond differently. They avoid reflection entirely. They double down on distraction. They bury themselves in noise, hoping that if they stay busy enough, they will not have to confront the deeper questions rising around them. Both responses are visible in the world today. Some people are becoming more spiritually curious than ever before. Others are becoming more indifferent. That divergence is exactly the kind of environment Jesus described. A moment in history where every person is quietly being invited to choose where their trust will rest. And the way people respond to that invitation often reveals something about the condition of their hearts, long before the final moment ever arrives. Jesus understood that the most important preparation for the last days was not gathering information about events. It was cultivating faith that could endure whatever events might come. Endurance requires depth, and depth is formed through relationship with God rather than through occasional interest in spiritual topics. If you have ever noticed how easily people become fascinated with predictions about the future while neglecting their present spiritual life, you have seen the imbalance Jesus was warning about. Curiosity about prophecy can become a distraction if it replaces obedience in everyday life. That is why Jesus repeatedly returned to the theme of watchfulness. Watchfulness means living with awareness, not constantly scanning the horizon for dramatic signs, but remaining attentive to the direction of your own life. Are you drifting toward truth or away from it? Are your decisions shaped by faith or by convenience? These questions matter far more than whether someone can explain every detail about the future. Because when the final moment arrives, knowledge about prophecy will not replace the need for relationship with God. That relationship is what anchors a person through every season of history. And the more clearly the signs Jesus described begin appearing in the world, the more urgent that relationship becomes. Yet even with all these warnings, Jesus did not present the last days as a story of hopelessness. He presented them as a moment of revelation, a moment when what has been hidden in the human heart becomes visible, a moment when people recognize what truly matters. And that revelation leads directly into the final warning he gave, one that brings together everything he had been describing from the beginning. The final warning Jesus gave about the last days brings everything together in a way that is both sobering and deeply clarifying. After describing deception, conflict, fear, spiritual dullness, and the testing,